should have checked the deed before you built that fence.
My name is Ethan Carter. I was 33 years old when I bought my house in one of the quietest neighborhoods I had ever lived in. The neighborhood looked perfect. Every lawn was trimmed. Every driveway was clean. Every house had the same polished suburban appearance. From the outside, it looked like the kind of place where nothing bad ever happened. That was exactly why I bought the house. I wanted peace. I wanted privacy. And most importantly, I wanted a place where nobody could tell me what to do with property I legally owned. For the first few months, everything was exactly what I wanted. Then one Saturday morning, I walked into my backyard and stopped. There was a fence. Not an old fence. Not a damaged fence. A completely new wooden privacy fence stretching across my backyard. Fresh posts, fresh boards, fresh concrete, and one very obvious problem. It was several feet inside my property. I stood there staring at it for almost a minute. I thought maybe I was looking at it from the wrong angle, so I walked toward it. Then I looked toward my neighbor's house. That was when I saw Rebecca Morgan. She was standing on the other side of the fence, holding a folder. Rebecca was 34 years old, and she had become the unofficial voice of our HOA. She was the kind of person who always seemed to know which neighbor had parked in the wrong place, which lawn was too long, which mailbox was the wrong color, and which homeowner had forgotten to submit an exterior modification request. She looked at me and smiled. I asked her one simple question. Why is there a fence in my backyard? She didn't look surprised. Instead, she raised a folder and said the fence marked the approved property boundary. I laughed because I thought she was joking. She wasn't. She told me the HOA had approved the construction. I asked her to show me where my property ended. She pointed at the fence. I asked her to show me the survey. She said the HOA had already reviewed everything. That answer bothered me, because I knew exactly where my property line was supposed to be, or at least I thought I did. I went back inside and pulled out the paperwork from my closing documents. I found the original deed. Then I found the property survey. I placed both documents on my kitchen table. At first, everything looked normal. Then I compared the boundary line on the survey with the location of the new fence. My stomach dropped. The fence wasn't close to the boundary. It wasn't 1 foot over. It wasn't a minor measurement error. It was several feet inside my property. Someone had built an entire fence across land that belonged to me, and they had done it confidently. That was the part that scared me, because people don't usually spend thousands of dollars building something on someone else's property by accident. Someone had believed they had the right to do it. The question was why. I decided not to argue with Rebecca. Not yet. I had learned a long time ago that anger makes people careless. Evidence makes them nervous. So I called a professional land surveyor. His name was Mark Davis. Mark arrived the following morning carrying professional surveying equipment. He looked at the fence. Then he looked at my documents. Then he looked at me. He told me he needed to take his own measurements. I agreed. For several hours, Mark moved around my property. He placed survey markers. He measured distances. He checked angles. He compared the current property lines with the recorded documents. I watched quietly. Rebecca watched too. She stood behind her fence as if she were waiting for Mark to prove me wrong. Then Mark stopped. He looked at his equipment. Then he looked at the fence. Then he looked at me. I asked him what he found. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked over and placed another survey marker in the grass. Then another. Then another. The markers created a line, and that line did not follow the fence. The legal property boundary was several feet away, inside the neighbor's supposed backyard. I looked at Mark. He finally said the words I already knew were coming. The fence is on your property. Rebecca heard him. Her expression changed. She walked toward us and demanded that we stop. Mark calmly explained that he was conducting a professional survey. Rebecca insisted the HOA had already approved the fence. Mark told her an HOA approval could not simply change a recorded property boundary. That was the first time I saw uncertainty on her face. She asked Mark if he was sure. He pointed toward the survey markers. Then he showed her the recorded measurements. Rebecca went silent. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong, because that afternoon I received an email from the HOA. It accused me of interfering with an approved neighborhood improvement. It told me to stop disturbing the fence, and it warned me that further interference could result in penalties. I read the message twice. Then I laughed. They were threatening me for objecting to a fence built on my own land, but I still didn't know why they were so confident. So I went looking for the answer, and that's when the story became much bigger than a fence. 2 days later, I was sitting inside the HOA clubhouse. Rebecca sat across from me. 3 board members sat beside her. The atmosphere felt less like a neighborhood meeting and more like a courtroom. Rebecca opened a folder. She said the fence had been approved. She said the neighbors had permission, and she said I was creating unnecessary conflict. I listened. Then I placed my property deed on the table. Nobody spoke. I placed the professional survey beside it. Still nobody spoke. Then I placed the original subdivision map on top. Rebecca looked at it. I watched her eyes move across the paper. She looked at the boundary. Then she looked at the fence location. One of the board members leaned forward. He asked Rebecca if she had seen this document before. She said she had not. I asked a simple question. Then what exactly did the HOA approve? Rebecca became defensive. She said the HOA relied on information provided by the homeowners. I asked her who provided it. She didn't answer. That was the first crack. The board members began asking each other questions. I could see they were realizing something was wrong. But Rebecca still refused to back down. She told me that regardless of the survey, she expected me to cooperate while the HOA investigated. I asked her how long that investigation would take. She said she couldn't give me a date. I told her I wasn't waiting. The next morning, I sent a formal notice. I informed the homeowners that the fence occupied my property. I gave them the opportunity to remove it. Instead of removing it, they doubled down. Rebecca sent another letter. This one was even more aggressive. It claimed that removing the fence could violate community standards. That was when I realized something. They weren't trying to protect the fence. They were trying to protect something behind it. I went back outside. I stood beside the fence. And for the first time, I noticed something I had completely overlooked. The ground behind the fence looked different. There was a narrow strip where the grass was slightly lower, almost like the earth had settled there. I called Mark again. I showed him what I had noticed. He stared at the ground for several seconds. Then he asked me a question. Do you have the original subdivision plans? I told him yes. He said he wanted to see them. That question changed everything. That evening, Mark came to my house. We spread the old subdivision plans across my kitchen table. Some of the documents were decades old. The paper had yellowed. The lines were faded. But the measurements were still readable. Mark studied them carefully. Then he pointed to a narrow strip running through the neighborhood. He said it was not simply a property boundary. It was part of an old utility access corridor. I asked him what that meant. He explained that the original development plans had reserved specific areas for infrastructure and access. I looked at the modern neighborhood map. The corridor seemed to disappear under several backyards. Then Mark looked at me. He asked when the neighborhood had been developed. I gave him the year. He nodded. Then he asked me to walk outside with him. We returned to the fence. Mark examined the ground. He walked slowly along the boundary. Then he stopped. He pointed toward a patch of soil. There was a slight depression. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that a normal homeowner would notice. But Mark knew what he was looking for. He told me the ground might be covering an old access structure. We didn't dig recklessly. We carefully exposed a small section of soil. After several minutes, something hard appeared. Concrete. I stared at it. Mark brushed away more dirt. A rectangular structure began to emerge. It wasn't part of the fence. It wasn't part of the backyard landscaping. It was old, very old, and it matched the location shown on the original subdivision documents. I went back inside. Mark placed the old plan next to the current survey. The lines matched. The fence had been built directly across the old access area. Then we found something even more important. The original documents showed that this section had never been transferred as part of the neighboring lot in the way the current landscaping suggested. The backyard everyone assumed belonged completely to the neighbor had been altered over the years. Landscaping had expanded. Fences had moved. And somewhere along the way the original boundary had effectively disappeared from view. but it had never disappeared from the records. Rebecca and the HOA had been treating the modern fence line as if it were the legal boundary. The documents told a different story, but there was still one question. Why had the HOA approved a fence directly over an old access area? The answer came from an even older document, a development plan from decades earlier, and that document revealed that this wasn't just a dispute between two homeowners. It affected multiple properties. The next morning, I delivered the formal notice. I didn't threaten anyone. I didn't yell. I didn't make a scene. I simply showed Rebecca the survey. Then I showed her the original documents. Then I showed her the location of the underground structure. Her face changed. For the first time, she didn't have an answer. She asked me what I wanted. I told her the same thing I had wanted from the beginning. I wanted my property returned. I wanted the fence removed from my land. And I wanted the records corrected. She asked me if I understood what removing the fence would do to their backyard. I told her that wasn't my decision. The fence had created the problem. The legal boundary was not something I had invented. A few days later, contractors arrived. They began carefully removing the fence, board by board, post by post. As the fence disappeared, the truth became obvious. The neighbor's backyard suddenly looked much smaller. A large portion of the space they had treated as their private yard was actually part of my property. Rebecca stood outside watching. She looked furious, but she couldn't stop it. The survey markers were there. The documents were there. And this time the HOA had no argument. Then something unexpected happened. The HOA board called an emergency meeting. Rebecca had apparently discovered the old subdivision documents, but she hadn't understood the full consequence. The board did, and they were terrified because the old utility corridor did not stop at my property. It continued through several neighboring lots. If the original records were correct, then other fences and landscaping structures across the community might also have been built over areas that were never legally transferred. Suddenly, my fence dispute became a neighborhood-wide problem. People who had spent years believing they owned every inch of their backyards were now checking their deeds. Neighbors started pulling out old surveys. Some discovered differences. Others discovered easements. And one homeowner discovered that part of their backyard had been landscaped over an access route decades earlier. The HOA had a serious problem, but I still didn't know the biggest secret. Then I received a letter from the county. The letter asked me to provide copies of the original survey. I thought it was routine. It wasn't. The county wanted to review the development records because someone had recently submitted a request to alter the neighborhood's property maps. Someone had tried to change the records, and that someone was connected to the HOA. I went back to the documents. I read everything, every page, every signature, every old map, and then I found it, a reference to a previous property adjustment. Years earlier, the HOA had attempted to standardize several backyard boundaries. The goal was to make the neighborhood look cleaner. The problem was that some of those adjustments had been made using physical fence locations instead of the original recorded boundaries. In other words, offenses had slowly become the new reality. People started treating them as property lines. The HOA started treating them as property lines. And eventually, almost everyone forgot where the actual boundaries were. But there was one more detail. The original documents had never been legally replaced. That meant the old boundaries still mattered. The fence in my backyard wasn't just misplaced. It was evidence of how the neighborhood had slowly rewritten its own landscape. Rebecca had thought she was enforcing HOA rules, but she had been relying on a boundary system that didn't match the recorded property documents. The emergency HOA meeting became the moment everything collapsed. Rebecca sat at the table. The board members looked exhausted. A county representative placed the original documents on the table. Then he explained what the records showed. The disputed fence had been built across my property. The underground structure was part of an old access corridor, and several other properties might require review. Nobody said anything. Rebecca finally looked at me. She asked why I hadn't simply accepted the HOA's decision. I told her the truth, because it wasn't your decision to make. The room went silent. She looked down at the documents. For the first time, she understood that the fence had never been the real issue. The real issue was ownership, records, and the assumption that a community rule could override a legal property boundary. The county ordered the relevant records to be reviewed. The HOA was required to stop treating the disputed fence line as an official property boundary, and the fence was gone. But there was one final surprise. A week later, I received another letter. This time it wasn't from the HOA. It was from the county records office. They had completed their preliminary review. The old subdivision plan was correct. The original boundaries were still legally documented, and the HOA had been relying on outdated community records. The letter ended with one sentence I will never forget. It said that my property rights had never changed. Only the fences had. I walked into my backyard that evening. The sun was setting. The fence was gone. The survey marker stood exactly where the legal boundary had always been. For months I had looked at that fence and thought it was a problem. I was wrong. The fence was only the symptom. The real problem was that everyone had stopped asking where the land actually ended. And once someone finally checked the records, the entire illusion collapsed. Rebecca never apologized. The HOA never admitted that they had been wrong. But they didn't need to. The empty space where the fence had stood said enough. My backyard was mine again. And the strange thing was that I never had to make their backyard useless. They had done that themselves. They built a fence on land they didn't own. They trusted a boundary that had never been legally theirs. And when the fence finally came down, they discovered just how much of their backyard had never belonged to them in the first place. That experience taught me something I will never forget. A fence can move. A landscaping line can move. A neighborhood can change. But a recorded property boundary doesn't disappear simply because everyone stops looking at it. And sometimes the most powerful thing a homeowner can do isn't fight louder. It is simply pull out the paperwork. Because when the documents are on your side, you don't need to win an argument. You just need to let the truth speak for itself. If you enjoyed this story, make sure you subscribe to HOA Reality 365, because the next neighborhood dispute might look completely ordinary at first. But just like this one, there may be something hidden underneath the surface. And sometimes the truth isn't behind the fence. Sometimes the truth is buried underneath it. Fire